Aboard the Author Reading Showcase, sponsored by Encircle Publications. My name is Bill Cadaro. I'm an independent publisher, author, and musician, and I'm honored to be your host for the virtual reading this evening. On behalf of Encircle Publication, the authors, and myself, I'd like to extend our hopes that everyone is faring as well as can be during this very interesting time in our shared human experience. Tonight, Encircle Publication is featuring 6 authors. They'll share readings with us from their latest and upcoming releases. We have Dane Cobain, author of Driven and the soon-to-be released The Tower Hill Terror. B.J. Magnani, author of The Queen of All Poisons. Richard Cass, author of The Last College, The Esposito, the latest in the Elder Darrow Mysteries, a Boston-based mystery series. Matthew Langdon Cost, author of I Am Cuba. Lara Tupper, author of Off Island. Kevin St. Jarre, author of Aliens, Drywall, and a Unicycle. So once again, thank you for joining us. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy this as we start with Dane Cobain, joining us from London, England. Dane?
Hello, everyone, and greetings from, as you said, London in England. You may see at the end of the frame here, my cat has decided to join me as well. I'm a writer in various different genres, but what I'm going to be talking about today are my mystery books, starring a detective called James Lightfold. And the way I describe them is kind of a contemporary sort of version of Miss Marple. If you imagine Miss Marple had access to Facebook and Twitter and things like that. So the first book, Driven, revolves around the death of a young woman who's hit by a car, but the twist is that there doesn't appear to be anybody driving the car. So we'll join in there. At chapter 1, Donna takes a walk. Donna Thompson turned the volume up on her iPhone, tightened her scarf, and started to walk a little faster. It was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were the worst day for tips. Tony's had been empty all day. It was also nighttime. After cashing up and waving goodbye to Tony, the eponymous boss who'd sunk his life savings into the place, she'd walked out of the cafe and started out on the long journey home. She lit a cigarette, looked both ways, and crossed the road. The streetlights shone down and made monsters in the shadows. She tugged nervously at a lock of her hair. Her fringe hung down to her eyes. Her face itched with a concealer that helped to hide the bags that grew when she worked too many late shifts. The deception was completed by layers of eyeshadow and mascara, and a thin line of eyeliner that made her look like a faux Egyptian pharaoh queen. Meanwhile, the cold air chafed at her lips, accentuating their pink tint and wearing away at her Carmex. She finished her cigarette and threw it into the gutter, then reapplied her lip balm without breaking a stride. It was a 20-minute walk to the station. While her boots kept her warm and dry, the soles of her feet were perpetually blistered from walking across the cafe's tiled floor. A black cab motored past her. Donna thought about flagging it down, but ignored the urge. She barely had enough to live on as it was, and luxuries were for other people. Besides, she knew she looked pretty good, a blue-eyed brunette with a reddish tinge and a hanging fringe, a size 10 dress, and decent legs that were covered with a thick pair of grey leggings. She wasn't a 10, but she thought she could pass for a 7 or an 8 if the lighting was good. And anything could happen in a sketchy area like this one. Like her mother had always told her, there were some bad people out there, and some of those people drove taxis. It was a cold, quiet night, too cold to stand around, with hardly any traffic and no other pedestrians in sight. Donna shivered and thrust her hands into her pockets, then continued to walk along the deserted street. It started to rain, and Donna realized just how impractical her clothes were. She was still a quarter mile from the station, and she had to walk back to her apartment when she reached her stop. She shivered as the rain started to gather momentum. She thought about waiting it out and decided against it. Better to press on, surely. At least that way she'd be able to dry off when she got home. The water had started to soak through her clothes and into her bones, and her hair was already tangled and matted, a far cry from the comfortable bun she'd tied it in when she left the house that morning. Her phone rang. With the water still pelting down and tearing at her eyes like a harpy, she willed herself to forget it. But her FOMO was kicking in, and the law of the vibrating device was too much to ignore. So she crouched in a narrow archway outside a house on Wentworth Road and pulled it out of her pocket to glance at the screen. It was an unknown number, and it caught her at a bad time, so she ignored it and packed her phone back away in her pocket. Instead, she stepped back out into the rain and hit a right at the traffic lights. She didn't notice the black sedan that was inching slowly along the road, a good 100 yards or so behind her. Donna walked along in a world of her own, mindlessly thinking about the hum of the wind in her ears, the smell of fresh rain in the middle of winter, and the slick sound of tires on grit. She reached the T-junction and looked to her left and then her right. Then she froze, illuminated by headlights. The black sedan had skidded off course and was heading towards the pavement. By the time she realized what was happening, it was already too late. Donna tried to dodge out of the way, but the vehicle clipped her side and sent her tumbling through the air. She died the second her head hit the asphalt. So yeah, book one is Driven, and that follows the the investigation into Donna Thompson's death there. And then we have book two, which is coming out soon, which is The Tower Hill Terror, and that follows. I don't want to give too many spoilers away, but basically there's a serial killer on the loose with quite a grisly approach to his crimes. Shall I read some more?
Were you going to read from book two, or are you good?
Yeah, I can read from book two. Yeah.
Yes.
So the way that I've tried to write these as well is that they can be read kind of as standalone mysteries for the individual cases, or you can read them sort of in a series and you'll get the same amount from them. Let's see. This section here introduces a couple of the police officers who work sort of sometimes alongside and sometimes opposite the main characters. Gary Mogford was about to knock off when the call came in. It was a Friday evening and he was ready for the weekend. He was on call, but he knew from experience that the crime rate would drop because it was cold, wet and rainy. But someone had screwed it all up by reporting a corpse in a hotel room. And then a helpful young lady called Karen had led him up to the third floor of the Grosvenor House Hotel, where a guilty-looking James Lightfold was dragging a concierge, spitting, cursing and still spewing, out into the hallway. James Lightfold, Mogford said, as Constable Jenny Groves grimaced and fingered her handcuffs beside him. Fancy seeing you here. We're going to need you to make a statement. So James Lightfold is the main character throughout the series. So here they head back to the Old Vic, which is the 19th century police station. It still houses 2/5 of the city's policemen. Mogford checked in with his boss. He found Chumley in the empty canteen. The governor was hiding out with a stack of paperwork, trying to make a dent in it without being disturbed every 10 minutes by a knock on the door. Ah, Chumley said, marking his place with a finger at the end of a paragraph. Mogford, how can I help you? Bad news, boss, Mogford replied. A body's been found at the Grosvenor House Hotel. Your old pal James Lightfold was at the scene. I thought you might want to have a word with him. What happened? He asked. Who was killed? Looks like Jane Lipton, Gov. Remember her? We've got men on the ground to secure the scene, and the body's on its way to the coroner. Lightfold was there when I arrived, boss, dragging their receptionist away from the crime scene. Is there any chance that the receptionist was behind it? Doesn't look like it, Mogford said. He needed a change of underwear, if you catch my drift. Doesn't seem the type to kill a fly. Nevertheless, it's a possibility. Mogford said nothing, and Chumley sighed and looked shrewdly across at his second in command. Okay, Chumley said. You speak to the hotel staff and see what you can figure out. I'll have a chat with James Lightfold. But you know what he's like. He's always in the wrong place at the wrong time. Which I think is a pretty good description of the character of James Lightfold.
Right on. Thank you, Dane. That was great. There's something almost lyrical and rhythmic about your writing and your reading there. Very neat. So thank you.
I try the old writer's trick of everything that you write, then reading it aloud to see whether it flows okay.
Yeah, right on. Well, thank you.
Cool.
And thank you for
for
sharing. Great.
Cheers.
Dane Cobain in London, England. Thank you, Dane. Next, we're going to go to BJ Magnani in Boston, Massachusetts. BJ?
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to all of you out there tonight who are joining us. My new book is The Queen of All Poisons, and it features the brilliant yet complex physician, Dr. Lily Robinson, who has an encyclopedic knowledge of all toxins and poisons, as well as a penchant for wearing stilettos. The origin of Lily Robinson came in 2009 when I was approached by the editor-in-chief of the journal Clinical Chemistry to write a series on toxicology for both educational and entertainment value. The art of secret poisoning ran for over a year as Dr. Robinson, an academic physician in one world and a covert assassin in another, used her skill with poisons to rid the world of undesirables who threatened international order. Here, in The Queen of All Poisons, the government once again appeals to Dr. Robinson to help eliminate a terrorist bent on mass poisoning. However, she soon realizes that the Russians have already released a deadly toxin in a surprisingly innocuous medium, and that time to save the country is running out. But first, let's start with the prologue, which takes us to Colombia, South America, many, many years ago, and before the present, of course. The little girl felt a soft hand push her head down. "Get under the cot now and stay down," Maggie shouted. There were many ear-splitting noises like a pop. No, it was a pop, pop, pop in quick succession. The child could hear men, not just Maggie, shouting in loud, angry voices, and her tiny body felt that wave of tingles spread outward in a fan pattern across her tummy. It always appeared when something scared her and she started to cry. As Maggie peered out from between the nylon zippered ends of the tent, she was crying too, and waved her hand behind her, trying to indicate shush. There were bodies everywhere, oozing small pieces of themselves onto the jungle floor. Maggie swung her head when she heard the swoosh of a machete. "Oh God, no, please don't hurt me, please," Maggie pleaded as a hand thrust through the split zipper and grabbed her by the hair, yanking her out through the opening. Maggie screamed as loud as she could while trying to free her head from his hands and scratched her way back towards the nylon. She howled one last time, and then there was quiet. There was a momentary lull within the tent, and the terrified child dared not move from under the cot. A very faint patter, like an insect scurrying across the ground, was the only sound she could hear. "Mommy? Mommy?" she whimpered. "Where's Mommy?" Her eyes finally opened. The basket of tiny frogs had tipped over, the lid off to one side, and one small yellow dot hopped towards the cot and jumped under a box. The little girl knew she wasn't supposed to touch it. Mommy had said so. Then there were voices again, men's voices. One came closer. A huge figure entered the tent and looked around. He kicked the grass basket and the rest of the frogs jumped out. She tried to hide deeper under the cot, but his hand grabbed the child and pulled her free. He said something to her in a language she didn't understand. The air seemed trapped in her lungs. It wasn't that she didn't want to breathe. She wasn't sure if she could breathe. The man took the bandana from around his neck and fastened it over her tear-filled green eyes. Everything went black. She felt herself being lifted, then carried over his shoulder. The sun was hot on the back of her head, and the steam in the air filled her nostrils. It was heavy air weighted with the smells of death. Although her eyes were covered, she squeezed the lids tightly together and felt the tears stream down her cheeks. "Angel, angel, please come to me. Take me up into heaven and help keep me safe," she prayed. Her small body could no longer hold attention, and her hands fell to her sides. She let go of her consciousness, drifting into the blackness as they moved into the jungle and disappeared into the emerald forest. And now part one takes us back to the present in the voice of Lily Robinson in Boston. Just between beats, there's a 20 millisecond window of vulnerability to create chaos just before the heart squeezes out its next beat. I keep thinking about the assassination while I'm sitting in my office. He was just another threat with a bad heart. My poison incurs sudden death, like a physical blow to the heart delivered at the right time. I try not to rationalize these deaths anymore or allow my emotions to creep in. Years of denial have trained my clinical mind to focus only on the target. I do whatever I must to get the job done. It's about mastering control, yet letting go. I hear a knock at the door, bringing my mind back into focus. It must be Lisa, best administrative assistant I've ever had, who anticipates my every professional need. Lisa knows I'm a physician with expertise in toxicology. That's all she knows. Her job is to keep my calendar and sort out when I'm at the hospital or at the medical school. Her biggest challenge is how to account for the days when I'm at neither. "Hi, Dr. Lilly. Just reminding you that you have a lecture at the medical school you have to prepare for. Do you have everything you need? Thanks, Lisa. I'm all set. Everything for the students is on the internal network. Okay, she says, rolling her eyes just a little as she spots my stilettos. Here's your itinerary for the day. You also have some meetings scheduled this afternoon, one with the dean and a last-minute meeting with someone named Chad. A meeting with Chad. The acid in my stomach begins to rise like a tide during a full moon. The pH of my entire gastric contents drops precipitously, and I find myself reaching around the back of my desk for antacids. Chad is Pixie Dust's replacement. That was her code name. A woman with a pink streak in her hair met me in my office years ago and begged me to help. She told me I would be serving my country. All I had to do was poison one man, an enemy of the state, and make it look like he died from natural causes. I was at a low point in my life when post-traumatic stress had hijacked my brain after a devastating incident on the job. I never really recovered. At the moment Pixie Dust asked, I probably could have been talked into anything. It's been years now. The agency has taught me well, and I hide behind their cloak of invisibility. My medical work keeps me in the city of Boston, where I take the T, as our subway is known, between the hospital and a small condo, central to the buzz of the hub. Yet the truth is, my home and my heart reside at a seaside cottage on the coast of Massachusetts, where I escape this life and that life. It's where I keep my poison garden, nurtured by the moist sea air and ready to yield the natural killers I need. There have been many bodies. My conscience still screams, but my ears have turned deaf. Pavlov would call it conditioning. I take solace in the realization that I'm not alone. A band of highly trained specialists sworn to protect this country and other democratic nations have fought by my side for many years. We are a team, subtly shaping the politics of the world by wiping out the bad and the ugly, protecting global freedom from the terror that swells beneath our feet. This is our mission, and I'm all in. The acid content of my stomach has reached epic proportions. When I see Chad this afternoon, I'll swallow the bitter pill that has become my treatment for unimaginable loss. The queen of all poisons. And I'd like to add that the proceeds, part of the proceeds from this book, will go to the College of American Pathologists Foundation, C-Test and Treat program, which helps support free cancer screening for breast and cervical cancer for women of need. Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
BJ, thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. And that is also interesting. I'm picking up some lyrical writing here. Angel, angel, please come to me. And the pH level drop precipitously. It's interesting as beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
BJ Magnani out of Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you, BJ. Next, we go to Richard Cass in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. Richard.
Good evening. As my friend Alfred Hitchcock used to say, I'm really pleased that you're here tonight. Hope you enjoy what I'm going to read. This is unpublished work. This is chapter 1 of Sweetie Bogan's Sorrow, which is the 5th book in the Elder Jarre Jazz Mystery Series, due out in September from Encircle Publications. As you may know, the Elder Jarre series is the story of an alcoholic who buys a dive in Westwood. She was singing with the trio from Berkeley who called her whenever they had a wedding gig. The club was a long way from course, waitresses in uniform, an open bar. My, Rasmussen said as she walked past his table during a break. A row of tiny diamonds along the edge of his ear glinted when he moved his head. That was something. She might only be 17, but she could recognize a man who wanted something that didn't belong to him. Thank you. And she walked on. He appeared at 3 more engagements in the next couple of months, persistent but polite. The first time she thought about having the bouncer chase him off. But he was a handsome man. If you ignored the colorless eyes under the sunglasses he wore inside and out.
Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Richard, if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask that we pause your reading for a moment, and we will go to the next person and maybe check your connection. We're losing you between, so it's hard to follow. Can you hear me? All right, Richard, so we're going to switch up. So we're going to come back to Richard later as he checks his connection. Thank you, Richard. Matthew Langdon Cost in Brunswick, Maine. Are you good to go, Matthew?
I'm good to go, Bill.
Super, thank you.
Hi, I'm Matthew Langdon Cost, and I'm going to read from my recently released historical fiction novel, I Am Cuba, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. I believe it's important to first clarify 2 things. In what way am I qualified to write this important piece of work, and what is historical fiction? I was inspired to write this novel back in my college days in a Latin American history class. The professor was so passionate that upon graduating college, I wrote the first draft of this book. That was back in 1990. Upon completion, I decided a few things. The first was I needed to work on my writing. And the second thing was I needed to do more research. And the third thing was actually piggybacks on the second, in the fact that I had to get to Cuba and do research there to gain a more sincere appreciation for what Cuba actually was. So I spent the next 25 years working on my writing, researching, and as I read more about Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, I would tweak parts of the manuscript and develop it better and make it, improve it along the way. And in 2016, I finally got an opportunity to visit Cuba. And I created a self-devised trip following the Revolutionary War trail of Fidel Castro across Cuba, 2 weeks long. And I learned many interesting things along the way. Probably the most fascinating thing that I'd struggled with all along that I learned was how 300 bearded guerrillas were able to defeat 12,000 government soldiers in open battle. And I figured that out when I climbed up to their base camp deep in the Sierra Maestra and realized how rugged the terrain was. This leads us to the question is, what is historical fiction? Strange oxymoron, if you will. Like when my wife used to work on Park Drive, 2 words that don't really go together. Historical, which is fact, and fiction, which is made up. And all historical fiction writers need to decide where on the spectrum they fall. Are they more into the historical side or more into the fictional side? As a history major and a former history teacher, I am very spot on my details of the historical aspect. And so I find that very important to be very accurate right down to Fidel Castro's Zippo lighter. But I do think that too much of the historical is like the bare bones of a subject. And to really understand something, you got to get into the emotions and the thoughts and the guts of the events and the people that take place. And this is really what brings history to life. So to this end, I use 2 fictional characters to spotlight the real characters and events of the Cuban Revolution. That being said, history at the best is an interpretation of the events of the past. If you had an event that happened yesterday with 5 eyewitnesses, they would give 5 different versions of what happened. And you magnify that over 50 or 60 years, and probably nowhere is this more complex than in terms of the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro. because there's two distinct camps of thought on the history. The first is that the carefully manipulated version as presented by Fidel Castro himself. And the second is the more hate-skewered version presented by exiles who were kicked out of their homes in Cuba by Fidel Castro himself. So this then, as much as anything, alongside the 25 to 30 years of historical work that I put into this and working on this manuscript, is that I'm able to be objective as an outsider looking in and try and find the truth between these two versions of Cuban history. That being said, I'd like to dive into chapter 1 of my manuscript, where my fictional character, Vicente Bolivar, is traveling from Havana to Eastern Cuba on the eve of insurrection and the start of the Cuban Revolution. Chapter 1, July 25th, 1953, Eastern Cuba. Vicente Bolivar pulled the 1952 Buick to the side of the road as he crested the hill overlooking Santiago. He was weary from the 500-mile-plus drive from Havana, but the sight of the sprawling city below, illuminated by the mid-afternoon sun at his back, revitalized him. It was as if he were home, even though he'd never been here in his life. He opened the door and unpeeled himself from the seat, breathing in deeply the air that was his heritage, his birthright, and his freedom. At just 19 years of age, Vicente was embarking upon the adventure of a lifetime, a thought that didn't slightly hesitate as it raced through his brain and disappeared over the mountains and into the sea. The day was stifling hot, the humidity rolling up from the ground where it was battered about by the strength of the sun rays, but Vicente didn't notice. His grandmother told him that his blood was made up of soil from so deep within the history of Cuba that it could not be affected by anything so trivial as air temperature. He squinted his eyes to better see through the haze as he gazed in wonder to the left of Santiago, where the town of Baracoa must lay hidden behind the mountains. Over 400 years earlier, his ancestor, Guama, had arrived on this easternmost tip of Cuba. He'd accompanied the great chief Hatui and 300 warriors in long canoes who traveled from Hispaniola to bring warning of the impending arrival of the Spaniards. A shiver went through Vicente as he thought of the valiant battle these ancient Taino natives had put up for years, before being all but exterminated by superior weapons, numbers, and disease. In Bayamo, Vicente had dropped 5 men at a safe house. They would be part of the distraction to detract from reinforcements coming from the garrison located there. He continued on alone, and for the past 4 hours the car had been silent, or as quiet as his thoughts allowed in the close confines of the Buick. The road had bumped along the edge of the Sierra Maestra, a mountain range that his grandmother had fled to after the failed Aponte slave uprising. The jagged land spiked its way into the sky, hiding valleys housing sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and bandits. Somewhere in these peaks, she discovered an oasis of Black liberation in the area of El Frijol, a community known as a palenque. In these rugged hills, this group of former slaves escaped detection for generations, and it was here that both his grandparents were born. When Jose Marti and Antonio Maceo had landed an invasion force near Baracoa in 1895, his grandfather had joined their quest for independence from Spanish colonialism. He'd watched both men succumb to their injuries sustained on the battlefield, but the spirit of the revolution continued. Riding at the side of the legendary general. Can you hear me okay, Bill?
Can hear you fine, yes. Thank you.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Riding at the side of the legendary general, Calixto Garcia, his grandfather had been witness to the growing swell that rose like the tide and swept the Spanish interlopers into a cowering mass within the walls of Santiago. The Mambises, Cuban peasants who began the war with machetes and now carried rifles, began to have their senses tickled with the sweet taste of freedom, like sucking upon the peeled sugar cane in the fields. Vicente could feel this history pulsating in his veins, his feet plunging into the earth as if rooted while his soul roared through the mountains and his face was splashed with the sea crashing upon the rocks. He was home. He again rubbed his left eye with his fist. In 1898, with victory and Cuban sovereignty all but realized, the United States had swooped in and stolen their triumph and forced Cuba to be henceforth be subjugated to their will. For the past 50-some years, this peonage had resulted in the advancement of the monetary interests of powerful American companies. Now, in 1953, the infrastructure and wealth of Cuba was foreknown. His grandmother had painted the history of Cuba with broad strokes that resonated with his being, but it was Fidel who had filled in the canvas by enlightening him to the tragic politics that had cursed the majority of Cubans to a life of poverty, poor health, and illiteracy. The green palm fronds glimmering in an almost translucent white in the glare of the setting sun. Down below, a peasant led his burro stacked high with sticks. A chicken wandered the side of the road looking for food, and Vicente could see a ship, either coming or going, in the port. This serenity would all be shattered tomorrow. He climbed back into the car and continued down into Santiago. His first stop was the Rex Hotel to pick up 3 men and then the train depot for the arrival of Raul Castro. Fidel's younger brother had just turned 22, but his baby face made him appear much younger than Vicente. On the outskirts of town, they idled in the shade of a small cluster of palm trees until several more cars arrived, and then the caravan proceeded 8 miles to the village of Siboney. A light on a tree signaled the thin road to the farmhouse where the rebels were gathering. Vicente was one of the few who knew why. So the next day, Fidel Castro is going to lead an insurrection on the Moncada military barracks in Santiago, Cuba. It's poorly organized, poorly armed, and is a disaster. I Am Cuba is an entertainment and accurate account of these events that are going to happen, which is one of the greatest underdog stories of all time. I want to leave you with just one little snippet from towards the end of the book, that I think gives a pretty good idea of who Fidel Castro was in 1959 when he came to power in Cuba. Fulgencio Batista had fled the country, and as he paraded his way to Havana to assume control, just outside of Havana in the town of Matanzas, Fidel is interviewed by Ed Sullivan for American TV. And towards the end of the interview, they both stand up as they're preparing to say goodbye. And they're in this town hall crowded with bearded gorillas who are all young, waving Tommy guns over their heads, cigars and smoking pipes and smoke swirling all over the place. And Ed Sullivan says to Fidel, "The people of the United States have great admiration for you and your men because you are made in the real American tradition of a George Washington or any man who takes on another powerful nation and wins. How do you feel about the United States?" And Fidel hesitates, pauses, ponders, and then softly replies, "The people of the United States are very focused and work extremely hard. I think this is because they come from all over the world, places where they were mistreated and persecuted, and then came together in the United States to form a great nation." These were the words of Fidel Castro when he was assuming power in Cuba. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you listened to me this evening. Again, my name is Matthew Langdon Cost, and my book is I Am Cuba, Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Back to you, Bill.
Matthew, thank you. Can you stay with us for a quick second? I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. I don't know if that's fair. Questions.
It might not be fair. 2 things. First of all, thank you. I'm a huge fan of literary fiction and like to write it myself, except have not. It takes a lot. So 2 questions. There was recent media about one of the candidates running for president in the States making a commentary about Castro and the early revolution. And my question is, for all your research and what you've come to, what is your feeling on the Castro of the revolution and the Castro of the dictatorship? And what is that experience? Like, does the person leave you with anything, or is it just fodder for sort of the story?
My expertise focuses on Fidel Castro leading up to January 8th, 1959. And that's what my book is about. I obviously have paid attention to Cuba history past that point, but I hesitate to delve into that. But I would tell you at January 8th in 1959, Castro was like a messiah figure in Cuba, but not just Cuba. He was a hero the entire world.
Yeah.
Very few
Revolution.
people disliked him, except perhaps the Dulles brothers in the United States. One was the Secretary of State, and the other was the director of the CIA. And they were both board members and large investors in United Fruit, which when Fidel nationalized that, that's when things began to sour. And I think perhaps we pushed Cuba out of our sphere of influence and into the sphere of influence of Russia.
Right on. My second question to you, and thank you for that. I could do this all night, but that's unfair to everybody. What drove you to, I don't want to call it an obsession, a passion for Cuba?
Well, it was sort of, as I mentioned earlier, that it was sparked by a Latin American history professor at Trinity College, where I went to. Took it my senior year, got very excited, wrote this manuscript, realized I had a lot more work, but at that point, the interest was ingrained. So I've carried it through for the last 30 years, following it and, researching it more.
Right on.
Actually taking my son on a trip to Cuba where he was my translator.
Right on, right on. Super. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the reading, and thank you for putting up with my questions. This was great.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill.
Right on. Matthew Langdon Cost. I am Cuba from Brunswick, Maine. Next, we're going to go to Lara Tupper in Western Massachusetts. Lara?
Hello, thanks, Bill. And thank you so much to Eddie Vincent and Cynthia Brackett Vincent and Deirdre Waite for putting this all together. It really is a lovely way to share work, particularly for those of us who had canceled events during book tours. It's a wonderful way to share our work during these very difficult times. So thank you for that. My book, Off Island, is a book that came out in January of this year. And it is based on the life of Paul Gauguin, the painter Paul Gauguin. He had a very interesting relationship with his wife, Metagad Gauguin. He, of course, sailed to Tahiti to paint there and to have affairs with young Tahitian ladies. He wrote very explicit letters home to his wife. She was in Denmark while he was in Tahiti. And I stumbled upon these letters in a exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York years and years ago. I saw these letters and I could not get them out of my mind. I wondered what was it like for Metagad to be home with the 5 kids, trying very hard to make ends meet while her husband was off gallivanting in Tahiti. So that was a question that framed this novel. What was it like to be the wife of Paul Gauguin? And it's interesting to follow Matthew because I did a lot of research myself, and I think those questions about how historical do you want your fiction to be are very interesting indeed. So I framed the question, what was it like for Metagad? And I also had this question, what if Paul Gauguin decided to go to Maine instead of Tahiti to paint? What if he went to a little island off the coast of Maine, such as Monhegan Island, and what would happen then? I picked Monhegan Island because I grew up in Booth Bay and spent a lot of time there. It's an actual artist colony, and I had those questions that frame the book. So I'm going to read from the very beginning. The book contains 2 intertwining stories, and one is set in 1903. the year that Paul Gauguin died, and one is set 100 years later in 2003. There are two couples a century apart. I'm going to read from each century, just a bit from each one. Oh, and before I do, I must show off my tiny little Paul Gauguin figure that my dear friend carved for me. I just had to show it off because I think that's so cool. It's inspiration. Thank you very much, dear friend who carved that for me. So here is the beginning of Off Island, and I begin with an epigraph, a quote from Paul Gauguin. He said, "Pure color, everything must be sacrificed to it." The Painter, 1903, New England. The northern island looked best in morning light, slices of sheer cold rays on rugged pines and cliffs, the gray-blue sea below. The edges were glacier-pocked, and the painter could imagine the ice sheets creeping over and creeping back, dumping bits of land where no land had been before. Mornings, the rocks looked like glaciers still, locked and frozen in mid-tumble toward the sea. If you squint, you can see clear to Portugal, the island pastor had told the painter. This reminded him. Decades ago, on a ship to Peru, the painter's father had said, "Look hard and you'll see your hairy aunt waving from the dock in Lima." Bile had filled the boy's throat, his body lodged in the bow of the ship as it pitched like a small tree in the strong storm. His father had wanted him to focus on a faraway place. He lifted his son with solid arms again and again as he spit up over the side. But when the ship reached Peru, no one waited at the dock, not even a priest. Lima was miles from the shore, the boy soon discovered, and his father wasn't there to point out which hairy aunt. His father's heart had stopped mid-journey. Bad heart, he'd heard the captain say. It was one part of a dim and planted memory, 4 years in Peru with his sad, distant mother, the particulars repeated by his mother's relatives so often the boy inherited the memories too. Not just the keeling of the ship and his queasiness, but the funeral at sea, the bulk of his father wrapped and sheeted and cast swiftly from the deck. Now, from the island in Maine, the painter tried but failed to see Portugal. He couldn't see Denmark either, where his own sons waited. Not that his vision wasn't excellent. His eyes and mouth seemed braced for something unpleasant, his brow dented with squint lines. At the glass in his rented room, he prodded at the lines, his hawkish nose weathered by sun, and absinthe, perhaps. His beard was still a tawny reddish color, a hardy shade of rust. Good looking, he'd thought that morning, like Robinson Crusoe. Now on the cliff, the painter stooped, hearing a sharp rustle behind him on the trail, the pastor, the landlady, the shush of thick clothing. He listened for voices, then twisted himself up to see 2 day trippers in long white dresses. He plunked down foolishly in the raspberry bush again and waited. "Look," said one, "a painter at work." Then they walked on, laughing like gulls, pointing at distant Port Clyde. The painter smelled the fruit about to turn, felt the tug of thorns on his pant leg. He plucked a pink berry and was disappointed to taste more seed than juice. He stayed there, squatting in the bush until the laughter was gone. So that is the section from The Painter, set in 1903. I'd like to just read a brief section from the modern couple. They are Pete and Molly. Pete is a painter, and Molly works at a bank. They have a young son named Emmett, and Pete is about to head back to Monhegan Island. He wants to investigate because he's heard that he has some relatives that live there. So he's just about to leave from Monhegan when this scene starts. It's set in mid-coast Maine in a fictional town called Bay Harbor, and I'll read from there. "I have to get back to the island," Pete says for the second time, like he doesn't have a choice about it. His voice is clipped like C-3PO, which makes Molly snort, which Pete mistakes as a snort about him leaving, about his needs and wants and talents. "You should," Molly says. Last time he'd left, She'd been stirring oatmeal for Emmett and hadn't bothered looking up at him, her husband. This time she looks. Let me go, she sees in his face. Please, please let me go. Are his eyes wet? Is he stoned? He's waiting for Molly to give permission. He wants to make this her fault, too. Molly's skin feels prickly, like she's sweating inside. This is happening. Something is actually breaking here. When are you coming back, she says. It's been so long since they've asked each other proper, direct questions. Her husband's boots are tied, his shirt is tucked. She can smell the shaving cream, fake limes. He trimmed his sideburns and the patch where his cheeks met his beard. The bubble-wrapped easel rests against the basement door behind him. Please tell Emmett, he says. She wills her heart to shut up, and it does, just long enough for something steely and beautiful to rise up to her throat. You're a real shit, she says. She turns to finish the dishes, and he doesn't wait for her to recover. He slams the door, he starts the truck. From above, she hears Emmett's voice, Mama, and she wakes then, running out in her rubber gloves to fix it. Pete fiddles with the lighter in his lap. Will you return, she shouts, today? But her husband's lips are set. He won't roll down the window. He turns one more time to look at her. I have to, his face says. I don't hate you, but I have to. Then he steers expertly around the potholes and is gone. Emmett stands on the front step, the leg of his stuffed big bird smeared with toothpaste. He yawns at the rattle and dust of the truck and asks his mother for breakfast. The water, he says, meaning the sink of dirty dishes filling up. I know, says Molly. She lifts her son and smells him, sour hair and mint. Ow, he says, tight. She puts him down and lets him run. A month passes. Pete doesn't come home. Molly's mother comes with paper towels and Lysol. Her sisters bring books and CDs, Codependent No More, How Stella Got Her Groove Back, Jagged Little Pill. The deli guy gives her half a pound of boiled ham for free. Someone leaves a dish of lasagna in her car. The plumber comes after months of not coming. Her cousins refill the driveway potholes without having to be told. Molly watches old episodes of Friends with her father, glad to hear his easy laugh in her living room. He throws his head back and the sound comes pealing out like a high-pitched cough or the beginning of a sneeze. There are plenty of amusing things left to consider, her father means. Grammy had a laugh like that, an unfiltered kind of cackle as Molly sat on a stool beside her long ago. She cut potatoes with a knife pointing toward her wrist, which Molly should never do herself. Grammy's fingers had ruts from cutting hard things the wrong way for decades. Remember Grammy's fingers, she said to her father during the commercial? Tough, he says. You laugh like her, she says. She sips some more of her tasteless tea, wanting a mojito. Laughter will make Molly less likely to sink. She will not sink. Sinking would make it impossible to deal with Emmett, hard to push back the Pier 1 coverlet and face more Cheerios. I like that Rachel, said her father, but he doesn't know what she sees in that Ross. Molly likes Chandler, who does everything Monica tells him to do. She decides she doesn't need her sister's books. She understood that Pete's inside solidified long ago that it wasn't really her fault. It's as though she married the giant cockroach man in Men in Black. On the outside, he seemed relatively normal, an occasional limp, a waft of sulfur, nothing too extraterrestrial. But inside, all along, he'd been oozing with alien cockroach parts. Her son's insides didn't have to be the same, Molly thought. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
My crabs. Thank you, Lara. That was great. Thank you. The imagery is stupendous. Great writing. Thank you. That was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Lara Tupper from Western Massachusetts. Next, we're going to go to Kevin St. Jarre from the coast of Maine. Kevin.
Right. Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks, Encircle Publications, for this opportunity to share this. So the book Aliens, Drywall, and a Unicycle actually comes from a strange place. I was writing an historical fiction novel for 2 or 3 years prior to this one. And at the end of that time, I had been held back and penned in by the parameters of writing historical fiction like that. And I just went a little nuts, I think, and I wrote this. Aliens Drywall on Unicycle is a story of a small town journalist who takes a new job in an apartment in a small New Hampshire town. It's a college town, and all the best apartments have already been taken. So he takes an apartment, he takes the worst apartment in town, basically. It's a 3-story apartment building. He's in the middle apartment. There's 9 total apartments, so he's got tenant above, below, on both sides. There isn't even an interior stairwell. You have to go out onto the balcony, and then there's wrought iron steps that all the tenants use to get down from their floors or up to their floors. And it's out on this balcony, the scene that I'm going to read to you, he meets one of his neighbors for the first time. He's already met one neighbor previously, but now he meets this other. So I'll just walk right into it. He carried the freshly poured glass out onto the balcony, leaned on the railing, and took a sip. The wine was warm and tannic, and the breeze smelled of asphalt. Well, with the railing rocking on loose screws, Tom surveyed the view. Portage, New Hampshire had been a mill town, but when the mill went silent, the municipality reinvented itself as a college town. The local school, once Portage State College, had grown to the point of joining the university system and had been reborn as Portage State University. Portage was hardly the same place, once a town with sidewalks full of men carrying lunch boxes, and next a main street of shuttered shops through the tough years. Portage had become a town of young people, university events, yoga, coffee shops, and wandering grad students who never seemed to leave. From Tom's vantage point, he could see red brick, white vinyl siding, glass pedestrians, small patches of green, and cars driving the short, circuitous route that was the downtown. The entire vista sloped down to the river. He looked forward to becoming part of the community. Tom had been a reporter at a smaller newspaper, writing stories and occasionally contributing columns until accepting the new position here at the Portage Herald. "Are you a teacher or something?" Tom turned and saw a man in his 30s, khaki shorts, and a loose button-down short-sleeved shirt, Birkenstocks, with a shaggy head of hair. "Why a teacher?" Tom asked. "Well, it's the middle of a summer work day and you're already drinking wine," he said and smiled. "I'm not a teacher," Tom said. "I'm Ben, 2C, he said, thumbing back at his door. "I'm Tom." He took another drink. "Moving in?" Ben asked. "Just about done. Just have to unpack the last of the boxes," Tom said. "What brought you here?" Tom smiled. "I'm taking a job at the Portage Herald. I've been with the Insider. Do you go to school here?" "I didn't go to school at all. I work at McDonald's," Ben said, and then added a bit too loudly, "Want fries with that?" Just as Tom was about to wonder if any of the neighbors would be able to participate in an intelligent conversation, Ben said, "Nope, no college eye. I'm proud to say that I'm an autodidact." Tom's eyebrows lifted. That was potentially interesting. "What have you taught yourself?" he asked. Ben said, "Name it, man. I never stop learning. I can't get enough." "You read a lot?" Ben said, "Man, I read all the time, whatever I can find. I also learn from the internet, TV, and movies. I learn from people too, man, because even though I'm like fucking chatty Cathy right now, I actually am an intense listener. You know, like I listen, man. I listen hard and it sticks. I just get bored if I can't be in charge of what I'm learning, you know, like being in control of what's going into my head, you know?" Tom's hopes had been initially raised, but he was becoming a bit more skeptical. "Tell me one thing you've learned. Impress me," Tom said. "I don't learn shit to impress people, man. It's impossible to impress people, man. Even when people are impressed, it's so fucking uncool to be impressed with anything that no one will admit it, you know?" Ben said. Tom smiled, nodded, took another sip. So the guy heard autodidactic on Jeopardy or something and is throwing it around now as an excuse for not furthering his education. Ben said, "All right, man, okay, how about this? I can speak Spanish." "So can the better prepared half of Americans," Tom said. Okay, man, but last Christmas, I could barely order in Taco Bell. Now I speak Spanish, man. You speak Spanish, Tom said. I speak fluent Spanish, man. I watch movies in Spanish now and understand pretty much all of it. I know Russian too. I'm learning Latin now, Ben said. Tom lowered his glass. You know Russian? I'm not bullshitting you, man. Why are you learning languages? Tom asked. Because otherwise, when I read translations, there's an intermediary between me and the author, man, and they can't help but change it. Not just because of linguistic issues either. It's all about ego, man. All these far-out ideas, but we get them filtered through some loser's biases before we even get to experience them. It did occur to Tom that the fast food genius had just referred to others as losers. So why do you work at McDonald's? Why not work at McDonald's? Ben asked. Because people look down on it? I'm not going to switch jobs because of what other people think. I'm good at my job and the people are friendly. But the pay, Tom said. Man, why are you looking for problems in my life? I make the money I need. I spend the rest of my time learning and experiencing shit. Yeah, man, I'm not a kid anymore and I work at McDonald's, but I don't live in my mother's basement. I don't make a living building weapons or lying to people, Ben said. Tom hadn't felt he was being negative and said, look, I didn't mean, you did mean it, man, but it's no thing. It's normal. We've been conditioned to be in a perpetually dissatisfied state, man, and we help each other maintain it, Ben said. It's the basis of ambition, Tom said. Man, you say ambition like it's a good thing, Ben said, and grinned, and they both laughed. Look, man, Ben said, you know the special sauce in Big Macs? Yeah, Thousand Island dressing, what about it? Dude, see, exactly, why? Why are you trying to take the special out of the sauce? That's a myth, man. It's not Thousand Island dressing. Chefs working for McDonald's came up with that recipe. In fact, it changed over the years, but not that long ago, the CEO ordered everybody to go back to the original recipe, and they had to find it because it got deleted. So they did some intense detective work, and they tracked it down. If it was just Thousand Island dressing, they could have bought it at any supermarket. Oh, okay, sorry, Tom said. So what's special about the sauce? Ben took a breath, seemed to relax a bit. It's special because it was made for one thing, to be the special sauce on a special sandwich. McDonald's sells 550 million Big Macs every year in the United States alone, dude. Can you think of a more successful sauce than that? Tom said, ketchup. Ben paused and then burst out laughing. Right on, man, right on. And Tom said, I should really get back to unpacking. Cool, cool, Ben said. It's nice meeting you. You too, Tom. I'll see you on the balcony. And Tom went back into his apartment, drank the last of the glass of wine, and surveyed the work that was left to do. So that's a bit of Aliens Drywall and a Unicycle. It's already available for pre-order on Encircle Publications. In fact, all the publications you've heard from tonight, you can go up there and find them. And thank you again for this opportunity to Eddie and Deirdre and everyone else.
Kevin, thank you very much. And I don't know if Tom was the name of the character at the end that was laughing, but so was I. Right on, right on.
Thanks.
Well done. Neat stuff. Kevin St. Jarre, thank you very much. We are going to try to go back to Richard Cast. Dick Cast now. Richard, are you connected? Richard. Do we have you, Richard?
It was there. Right now he's muted. I'm trying to unmute him.
Richard, do you have an unmute button in case Eddie can't? Yeah, heard you for a second. All right, Richard, we'll give you another second. Can you hear us? I cannot hear you. I'm going to just pause for a minute and put it on mute and check with Richard. While I do that, Kevin, I did want to ask, there is a book named sushi, Einstein, elves, and some ridiculous title that I loved the book. And when I read your title, I thought, I just loved the title. How does that not? How does that not catch you? Aliens,
it was never
drywall.
supposed to be the title. It was just a working title, and I was like, what is this book about? And I was like, well, there's a woman who believes in aliens. There's a guy who rides there's two brothers who hang drywall. There's a guy who rides a unicycle. I took the people out of it and ended up with just these random things, and it stuck. So
Right on. I like it. It's a very, very interesting. How can you not be interested in that? Aliens, drywall, and unicycles. Thank you. Let me check with
Bill.
yes.
He can't get online. I'm going back
Alrighty.
and forth with him.
All right. So we will have
Done for the evening.
we will have Richard at the next reading that Encircle Publication hosts. So super. All right. Well, we would like to thank everybody for joining us. We would like to wish you well and all of us well, and hope you fare well during these interesting times. And one of the positive things that I have seen, as a matter of fact, when I hang up here, I'm joining a virtual jam session for a former Thursday night acoustic jam that used to occur at a friend of mine's place. So we'll do a virtual one after this. And one of the positives coming out of this is everybody coming together, both personally at home, because where else can you go, and then online to share. So I've seen virtual cocktail parties in the house and bar crawls where they're just going room to room. And then we'll do music. And now we've done this great art. So thank you to all the authors. Thank you for reading. Really, really good stuff. And thank you to everybody for joining. Have a great night. Be well. Cheers.